On behalf of my co-moderator, Grace Wang, I would like to welcome everyone to the Young Surgeons session. I would like to apologize for not having Vic Kashyap here. He has a family emergency and will not be able to be with us as a co-moderator. A few things that I need to disclose. Every speaker should really announce their conflicts of interest, whether they have any or not, and the moderators are supposed to essentially pick up on any conflict of interest during the presentation. The SVS also designates this activity for a maximum of 32.25 AMA PRA Category 1 credits. So without any further ado, I would like to start the program by introducing my former mentor and boss, Dr. Craig Kent, who is the current chair of surgery at the University of Wisconsin. Dr. Kent will be talking to us about evolving employment models.
So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here today. And unfortunately, one of the things that comes along with being chair of surgery is you have to start thinking a lot about economics and economic models and that sort. So I suppose that's probably why I've been drafted into this role. What I'd like to do is spend the next few minutes just chatting about what I think is going to happen in the future and what's in present tense in terms of employment models. I see in the audience a number of relatively young people who are either looking for their first job or will have one or are part of their first job. And there's a lot that's changed in terms of surgeons and independence in practice over the past few years, and I'd like to run through some of that. So I'll start with this slide, which shows that back in the year 2000, about half of us were independent and the other half were employed. And I just have data through 2010. You can see about 70% of surgeons, this isn't vascular surgeons, but surgeons across the board are employed. So this is clearly a trend. If I am going to look into my crystal ball, I think this is what I see, is that probably in the next 10 years, 100% of surgeons will be employed. There's some interesting reasons for it. So our surgeon leader, Obama, has created a new health plan, and there's some very positive aspects of it and some of them that aren't so positive. I think many of the aspects that are positive could potentially have a negative impact on surgeons, and that's what I want to spend the next couple of minutes on. So the model that we have now is a fee-for-service model, and so the idea is that the more cases that you can find, the more operating you can do, the more money you can make. And interestingly enough, since surgeons' cases make a margin for the hospital, the more cases we do, the more the hospital makes. So it's this incredible synergy, one that's really allowed surgeons over the years to have a fairly dominant role in our healthcare systems. So the new model is a population health model, right? And the idea is that you want to prevent disease. You don't want any disease to happen. And if it does happen, you want to take care of it in an incredibly efficient way without any cost. And so, where do surgeons fit into that? Because what we do costs money. And so let's just talk for a second about what's called capitation. And this is that population health model. And the idea is that an insurance company gives an institution, a healthcare institution, a certain amount of money to take care of a person per year. And so I looked up one of our capitated plans, and so they give our institution about $4,000 a year to take care of the patient. Now, we can do whatever we want with that $4,000. If it turns out that we want to do 3 operations on that patient and it costs the system $100,000, then we're minus 96, right? Or if we want to take really good care of this patient and not ever have surgery, then maybe we'll actually make money on the $4,000 a year. So, the truth is that surgery costs money, and in this new capitated system, there's going to be this intense pressure to do as little surgery as possible. And now the phone call with your CEO is, get out there, find more cases, do something innovative, get the robot working, bring those patients in from the region because we get a margin on those patients. But in population health, as we evolve forward, what's going to happen is your CEO is going to be telling you not to operate. Of course, we still need to take great care of patients, but it's not going to be the entrepreneurial sort of environment that surgeons have lived in that have allowed us to be dominant. I think what's going to happen, instead of being a revenue center, and that's what we are for hospitals now. We bring money into hospitals. We're going to be a cost center. And cost centers, it's never good to be a cost center because, they're trying to figure out how to fund you. A revenue center is clearly the place to be, and maybe what'll happen is that we'll become part of the herd. So that's the setting of why I think we're evolving much more from an independent practice model to an employed model. Hospitals, healthcare systems are going to want to employ their surgeons because you employ people that are part of your cost centers. There's some really good reasons to become employed. There's some financial certainty, a guaranteed salary at least for a year. Your organization provides you infrastructure so you don't have to go out and hire your own people. There's a lot of people that like a controlled lifestyle, particularly in our new generation, and this is one that's a controlled lifestyle. These healthcare systems have lots of primary care physicians, so you have these automatic referrals, and to be out in independent practice and try to compete with these large health systems that are centered on their own surgeons is difficult. And then there are issues with malpractice that healthcare systems can deal with much more readily than people in independent practice. The other issue, from the standpoint of the institution, it's better to have employed surgeons too, right? Because you get these, in the future, if we get these bundled payments, they have to figure out how to divide it up. And so owning your surgeons or salarying your surgeons is going to be easier. If you're thinking about quality initiatives, they can be incorporated as part of your salary, as we'll discuss in a minute. And these larger organizations are better at resolving conflicts. There are some disadvantages of an employed model. Lots of bosses, that's why some of us many years ago went into surgery, so we didn't want too many bosses, and look what happened. You're told what your salary is going to be. It's not as entrepreneurial. And the other thing is you have to align with the organization's goals, and if you don't, you're a captive audience. And then sometimes you like to own your own infrastructure because you can make people work directly for you a little bit more efficiently than maybe the organization can accomplish that. And then there's this question is whether if you're on a salary, you'll be less productive. So there are ways in an employed model to mitigate some of these issues. One of them is to become a leader, right? Become head of your practice plan or be involved in your practice plan. And the truth is, even though you're employed by these healthcare organizations, they need to make you happy, because if they don't make you happy, you're going to go down the street to another organization that'll recruit you. So being involved, I think, is the solution to some of those negatives. There's a lot of different employed models out there. They range from the academic platform that I'm part of, federal government, the VA, county or city hospitals, and then there's multi-specialty groups that will employ physicians, hospitals will employ physicians, and then increasingly healthcare organizations that include hospital and physician groups will employ surgeons. So there's a lot of different possibilities. Getting to the models themselves, if you've seen one model, you've seen one model. I mean, all of these different healthcare organizations look a little different. If you're out there looking, these are things you got to consider. What's my salary going to be? Can I get a bonus? What determines my salary? How often am I on call? How many operations do I need to do? Do I have vacation, CME? All of things that you might anticipate are important to look at very closely, the model that you might be assuming. And then there are some intangibles. Am I a fit in this healthcare organization? So maybe it's a very sort of economic-driven organization and you're more interested in research, or maybe it's a research institution and you're more interested in just taking care of patients. So making sure that you culturally fit in that organization is really important. When you look at specific models, there's this this choice. You're either salaried or you're employed based upon incentives, and so that's the choice. And so there's different variations on the theme, and so I'd like to go through some of those variations. The first is you're just salaried. You're given a salary. You're going to make $100 a year for doing this work, and there are benchmarks for salaries. There's a lot of different organizations that create these benchmarks. They do it from collecting data from multiple organizations. The AAMC is the one that's most often used by academic medical centers. On the opposite end of the spectrum is Sullivan Carter, which is more of a private practice. And these benchmarks are both in terms of what the average salary for a vascular surgeon might be, and on the opposite end, what's the amount of work in RVUs that a vascular surgeon might perform. And here are some numbers for vascular surgeons. So MGMA says that the average compensation for a vascular surgeon ought to be $450,000, but to do that, to receive that salary, you should perform around 8,000 RVUs, and you can look through the list. The numbers actually don't vary that much, although as a whole, the AAMC has lower salaries and lower RVU requirements because it's an academic assessment, and the private practice ones usually have higher RVUs and higher salaries. So then a second model is to salary somebody, but not just use the benchmarks, but to use a number of intangibles. And so here are some of the intangibles. What's the hospital down the street paying vascular surgeons? You're thinking of leaving, but you're valuable to the institution. What kind of reputation do you bring into the organization? How important are you overall to the organization? And so it's a benchmark plus these intangibles in terms of what you contribute to the organization. And there's a lesson there. That is, always be really important to your organization, because if you are, they're not going to let you go. They're going to figure out a way to maintain you and keep you there, and they'll modify your salary to accomplish that. And then the opposite end of the spectrum is this pure incentive-based model. And it can be anything. I mean, incentive is whatever you want to incent, right? So the traditional is RVUs, clinical work, and that could be, RVUs measure the amount of work you do. Revenue is the amount of money that you bring in. There may or may not always be a correlation between the two. A lot of organizations now are incenting based on quality, okay? So if your patient satisfaction's good, 5% of your revenue or 5% of your salary is based upon that. Citizenship, do you assign your charts? There are even some organizations now that are looking at their overall performance. So if it turns out we make money this year, everybody gets 5% more in their salary. If we lose money this year, we get 5% less in our salary. And then there's some personal things like whether you have a leadership role, whether you have a specific goal in building a program or in an academic organization, what your productivity is. And then there are organizations that pay you based upon a salary plus incentive. So there's all kinds of different combinations of salary and incentive and different ways to accomplish that. The truth is, many organizations now pay you based just on RVUs, just on the amount of work you do. But I think that's a formula of the past. And as we move forward and quality and cost become important, what's going to happen over time, particularly in years to come, is that we're going to be paid for other things other than just producing clinical work, our citizenship, our leadership, as well as our ability to provide quality of care. I'll just end with 3 quick examples. The first is my department of surgery. We have 100 surgeons in the department, and we actually, even though we're an academic institution, have an incentive-based plan, and this is what it looks like. About 40% of your salary is based upon the revenue you bring in. Another 40% is based upon the RVUs that you produce. 17% is an academic incentive where we take a pool of dollars, 17% of the revenue, and we redistribute it to people that are doing academic work. And 3% is based upon compliance. Here's our academic incentive plan. We reward people for educational activities, research, leadership activities, and it's a point system that we use to determine who gets that 17%. Here's our compliance plan. The bottom line is that we reserve 3% of everybody's revenue, and if you sign your charts and you sign your operative reports and you do all the things you're supposed to do, you get the 3% back. If you don't do that, you don't get the 3% back. So there's something in it for compliance. Here's a sort of a spectrum of my department. I have 8 people that are out of sync in compliance, so they're not going to get their 3% back. It's amazing since we started that plan how that has improved. I now have only 1 person that's out of compliance. 3% of your revenue makes a difference to people. Here's a second healthcare organization. This is a large multi-specialty clinic. They salary people. And so they start with a benchmark salary, but then they modify it. And they modify it based upon your RVU production, local market pressures, all the things that we discussed before. In fact, it seems a little arbitrary in this healthcare system as to what your salary is going to be from one year to the next, because there's the tangible parts of it, the benchmarks, but then all these other intangibles that go into the equation. And so what they do, once they assign your salary on a yearly basis, they put it to this committee, and this committee makes the final approval. So if there's something that really is off base or not fair, this committee has the chance to oversee the compensation. Here's a third healthcare organization that's a kind of a combination of salary and incentive, and I chose this one for a reason. They have 5 salary levels based upon numerous factors that I couldn't figure out, and they have 20% of the salary as bonus based upon another group of factors that I couldn't sort out. Here are some of the schematics that they show their people that work for them, and I couldn't figure those out. And I think what it really means is if you can't understand the plan of your organization, that's not a great organization to work for. There's not a lot of transparency. So I'll end by saying that when you're developing a compensation plan, transparency is important. Internal equity is important, making sure that you're competitive with other organizations, making sure that the physicians are an important part of the creation and implementation of that plan, and that the incentives that you have parallel those of the strategic initiatives of the organization. The take-home message, become accustomed to the concept of being employed, because I think you all will be at some point along the way. understand your compensation model well before you sign on. Participate in that model and the leadership of the healthcare organization, and make sure the values of that organization match yours. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be with you.
Thanks very much, Dr. Kent. Our next speaker is Dr. Gilbert Upchurch, comes from the University of Virginia Medical Center in Charlottesville, Virginia, and he's going to tell us what to do when cardiologists start doing EVARs at your institution.
I was thinking of some funny introductory remarks, and my first thought was this would be actually a better talk given it if the interventional radiologist or the cardiologist had asked me. Because it's okay if vascular surgeons think you're a nice guy, but if your competitors think you're a nice guy, then maybe you're doing something wrong. So I'm a Zen master, a karate guy. So while they gave me the title Managing Turf Battles, I'm going to turn this into sort of finding competitive synergy, and I'll get to that in a second. I must also say that I'm following Dr. Kent, who is an amazing speaker. Dr. Mills is an amazing speaker, and we've got Dr. Samson as the caboose. So I felt like I needed to make this somewhat entertaining. So this is how I started to prepare for this talk. I really said yes before I knew that what the topic really was when Robbie asked me. I did a lit search because I'm a scientist, and all scientists go to PubMed.org before they agree to give any talk. I wrote down some of my own thoughts, and then I really consulted my wife and the fellows and the residents. This is my wife. She's still that beautiful, and I have no hair, so it's a little bit different. I always tell people, this is aimed at the young people. There are a lot of old people, Dr. Mills, Ozaki, Samson, Brown, sitting out in the audience. You guys can fall asleep or check your email while I'm giving this talk. But I always say, beware the person who tells you how to run your practice, except for your in-laws or your parents. And then my second adage for this would be to listen to your parents. They're usually right. And here I am graduating from medical school. So here I am in my Zen master mode, sort of what is competitive synergy? And my first thought was competitive synergy is living in the state of Michigan, having graduated from UNC Chapel Hill and beaten the living stink out of Michigan State. But then I went to, I'm a modern vascular surgeon, then I went to Wikipedia. And so then I looked up the word synergy, which means to work together and, produce something that's better than the sum of the whole. And then I looked up competitive, which is the exact opposite. It's good service. You offer somebody something that's attractive, and you give them good value for their money. You give your buyers, who are your patients. So if you're thinking about your patients, that's the takeaway message from my whole talk, is you always have to think about what's best for the patient. So I figured coming back to dear old Massachusetts, where I train, I always have to, I actually, it's a little bit of a HIPAA violation, but as a resident, I took care of Tip O'Neill. And he's famous for saying that all politics are local. So with that in mind, I'm going to give you 6 pointers. And that's it, 6, not even 10. It's not even David Letterman as to what you think, as to how I think you can learn to get along in your own environment. So as a young surgeon or faculty member, you need to focus on quality. Now this is a paper that was published in the Journal of the American College of Surgeons. John Cowan is a neurosurgeon now in private practice. Justin Demick, everybody knows. He writes papers in JAMA and New England Journal of Medicine, et cetera. And this would look like your typical formula Demick, Cowan, Upchurch volume outcome paper if you just sort of looked at this. But if you looked at it deeper and you looked at some of the tables, what this really showed was it's not really what you call yourself that's important, it's what you do. So if you do a lot of carotid endarterectomies, you won't have strokes. And it turns out that if you're a neurosurgeon and you do 100 carotid endarterectomies, likely you're not having strokes. So it's really about what you do. And as a young vascular surgeon, always focus on quality. The second thing is I think this is a really interesting thing. I worked with a guy named Dave Williams, and you'll see these are some slides. These are some basic science slides. The guy, he really, along with the guys at Stanford, helped define static, dynamic flaps in aortic dissections and how you should treat a static versus a dynamic flap. One, you'd put a stent graft in. The other one, you stent the visceral vessel. And so, here's this guy who's an interventional radiologist. He would come in at midnight to actually cut aortic specimens, to actually understand whether something was a pseudoaneurysm versus a dissection. I learned more about aortic dissections from this guy, who's not a vascular surgeon, not a cardiac surgeon, than anybody. So I think it's really important that you can learn from other specialties. this is sort of getting back at, following Dr. Kent, realize the hospital is king. The UVA has, we have a $100 million addition of a bunch of ICU beds off the front, and the University of Michigan, a $275 million cardiovascular center. If you're thinking about how you're going to get along in your own institution and with the radiologist and the cardiologist, always think about what you do from the CEO's standpoint. Now, I see Dr. Samson sort of wiggling a little bit there, but that's sort of my goal is to make you, synergistic with those around you, not to make you more competitive. So I think that one thing that everybody in this room will recognize is that vascular surgery is no longer homogeneous. When I left Michigan, I'd see 35 patients in clinic, and 30 of them had aneurysms. Now I moved to University of Virginia, and I do more sort of the bread and butter of all of vascular surgeries. But not everybody in this room is going to go out and put people on left heart bypass and do thoracoabdominal aneurysms, or fenestrated endografts for that matter. You really need to exploit everybody's individual talents. I see Megan Tracy's she's one of my partners. She's in the audience. She's an amazing open and endovascular surgeon. And there were really just 3 of us when we started, and we needed a vein center. I looked around and, sort of like, tag, you're it. She wasn't really born to do veins. She wasn't that interested in it. She'd much rather be doing open thoracoabdominal aneurysms. But she did it because it was good for the team, and I think that's a really important thing. And here are my team members, and we all have strengths and weaknesses. Some are really good at open, some are really good at endovascular. I think this applies to the young people in the audience, both clinically as well as academically. And that, remember, your patient care extends over multiple departments and multiple disciplines. I think that's just an important thing to recognize. So I would say money is the root of all evil. You really need your people and your partners all working together. You really should compete externally rather than internally. And I found this is 2 years old. I used to have a bunch of stuff on the outside of my door, and you can see, I'm going to highlight this thing right here in sort of the middle. And what that basically was there's a little teeny town about 25 minutes west of Charlottesville called, I can't remember the name, but the hospital is Augusta Medical Center, and they have this beautiful freestanding heart and vascular center. So, we were so far removed from getting a heart and vascular center at the University of Virginia, I just scratched out Augusta and put UVA Heart and Vascular Center there. So just remember, you need to really compete externally, not internally. Like I said in the beginning of my talk, this is going to be the shortest talk. I win teaching awards for starting late and finishing early, but this is my last point, which is really vascular surgeons are uniformly the best doctors in the hospital. I heard Mike Belkin give his New England vascular talk. We really get called to save lives all the time, and this will happen to you. Avoid being like an orthopedic surgeon, that is, forgetting all the medicine you learn in your residency and fellowship. This was a good old boy from West Virginia who was the first homemade fenestrated graft I did when I got to the University of Virginia. And I just think the key is to always focus on the patient. So in summary, as a young surgeon, easy, focus on quality, take the high road. Recognize that you can learn something from other specialties. The hospital is king. Dr. Kent went into a fair amount. That really sort of depends on where you practice. If you're still an independent practitioner, maybe that's not true, but it sure is true for me. Vascular surgery is no longer homogeneous. We are not all great basic science researchers or great educators or great necessarily thoracoabdominal aneurysm surgeons. You need to have a good team. Money is the root of all evil, except for when it's coming into your pocket, of course. But I would just say in general, if you could avoid thinking about how much you're getting paid and focus on the patient, that would really be the best thing. So thank you very much, both Robbie and Grace, for letting me give this talk.
Thank you, Gib. I'm sure we're going to have a lot of discussion during the panel discussion. The next speaker is Dr. Joe Mills from the University of Arizona. Dr. Mills is going to give us some tips on how to get promoted.
Thanks very much for asking me. I apologize in advance. So I like to give talks based on data, but I'm going to give more talks on philosophy. And I don't want you to fall asleep already and think this is some old guy that's just going to talk about stuff and ramble. But I think I've been a vascular surgeon for 27 years. I've been in academics the whole time. And I think the thing that you need to do when you start is don't stop thinking. Because what happens sometimes is you get busy, you start doing a lot of things, And before you know it, your family's growing up, your career's kind of gone somewhere where you didn't intend it to, and you never really stopped to slow down to figure out what you wanted. So I am going to talk about promotions, but it's more, how does this advance? There we go. So questions you should be asking yourself even now is, what are your career goals? And sometimes you don't know right away, because I found in my life you have to figure out what opportunities are around you and take advantage of them. But start thinking about that early on. What are your goals in life? And then can those two things be balanced? And I think the answer, the easy answer is yes. If you really want an exciting career and you want to influence people and be part of a great profession and still be a good family person and have a great family, you can do both of those. If you try to add a lot of other stuff, it gets more complicated. So you got to decide up front what's important and can you accomplish both. I assure you can accomplish career goals and life goals centered around a family. Other things, what are you good at? I mean, don't go into academics because you think it's cool, but are you good at it? Is it something you enjoy doing? Do you like doing it? If you don't like to write papers, don't go someplace where the expectation is you're going to write papers, because you're not going to fit and you're going to be unhappy. I think one thing that both speakers have sort of emphasized, I'd put it in a different way, is how can you contribute to the institution? So think about yourself more broadly, and how, when you get somewhere, look for a need. And is there a need in your institution that you could fulfill that would contribute to the institution? Because if you can do that, you'll become valuable. I think if you spend every day doing what you enjoy doing and something you're good at, and you're also helping other people while you're doing it, you should be happy. So if you're a physician, especially a vascular surgeon, you should just be happy. There's not much reason not to be. Now, that sounds too simple. So first of all, I think you should have these continuous performance goals. So make yourself useful. I mean, that example that Gib gave about somebody opening a vein practice for their group, because there was a group need. So you don't want, I'll talk later about how you don't want to get into some role where that's all you do and that wasn't your initial intent, but you're going to have to do things that you don't like sometimes. I also think it's really important to keep learning new skills. Don't think that you've mastered everything, and if you trained at the best aortic place in the world, don't think you're going to go somewhere else and develop the next best aortic place in the world, because it may not be possible. But you also have to learn new techniques to keep up. And to succeed, you're going to have to redefine yourself. You're not going to be, and I'm doing stuff now I never would have envisioned I would have been doing when I started. So the thing on the right, I want you to be innovative and to think about doing new things, but if you find yourself constantly going in the opposite direction from your partners, in the opposite direction from your institution, there's something wrong there. Either your expectations are not right or the institution's screwed up. But try to kind of get in line with institutional priorities or you'll be unhappy. I'm going to only just mention this. So I think things have gotten better, but in academics, there's definite issues with race and gender as far as promotion, and there's the thought of either being a glass ceiling or a sticky floor. There's data to support that. Things have improved a lot, but they're not where they should be. Now, the other thing to think about, so you're thinking about a certain position, you're going to change positions, you might get a promotion. What is the position that you're being hired for, and what are the expectations? So if those two don't match, you're not going to be happy. How are they going to assess your performance? So if you get hired for a job, and these are the expectations, what measurements are going to be used to determine success? And then when you're taking a job or looking at a promotion, is there a mentor if you need one? Most of us do at some point in our career. And are there enough resources? The other thing I really find it in my own sons. So I have 3 sons between 27 and 34, and they're really solid people. They're really successful, but they sometimes are afraid to try new things. And I think you need to be realistic, but don't aim too low. Always have aspirations, and don't sell yourself short. The other thing is you're going to fail. If you never fail, then you're not doing much, because we all fail. And so don't be afraid to fail. Now, I think the corollary of that is don't make it a habit either, because that's not good. But if you don't try new things and don't stress yourself a little bit, you won't reach your potential. So don't be afraid to make mistakes. And the corollary, though, is if you find yourself in a hole, the first rule of hole digging is sometimes just to stop digging. So then when you fail, then sit back and analyze, why did I fail, and how can I do better next time? So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on specific institutional guidelines because they vary somewhat, but most institutions have developed 3 tracks, and tenure, they've talked about tenure going away. Petersdorf wrote an editorial in JAMA, I think, in 1984, and I'll get into a little bit if we have time about how tenure came to be, but basically most places have 3 tracks now. There's an academic track, which is severely limited in some institutions. because you're being compared basically with basic science people who have no clinical obligations. There's the clinical scholar track, which isn't usually tenured in most places, and then there's a pure clinical track. So how do you work your way through that? Well, first of all, know what's expected of you and try at least to meet those expectations, if not exceed them. And start off early on. Find out in your own institution what the P&T process is. I was head of the Department of Surgery's Promotion and Tenure Committee for 12, 13 years, and people sometimes would never do any of the required things, and they'd reach their final stage and couldn't advance to associate professor and have to leave. And it wasn't because they weren't good people, but they didn't plan ahead. There is a way to get around this. You can develop a teaching portfolio. So some institutions require that, some don't, but basically you can go through what the requirements are at your own institution to make sure you reach those goals. I don't know if you're familiar with the H-index. That's kind of interesting metric. It's used a lot in non-medical tracks, but it turns out it works pretty well for medicine. So basically an H-index takes how many articles you have in your field and how many times you've been cited. So a pretty successful, like an associate professor, might have an H-index of 20. So that means you've had 20 papers that have been cited at least 20 times. And then it also looks at how many papers you've had that have been cited 10 times. So I started playing with this a few years ago. It's been looked at for neurosurgery, and it's kind of specialty specific, because obviously if you have a small specialty, and vascular is relatively small, you're not going to ever get the number of citations that someone might get, for example, who discovers some new thing about DNA that has lots of influence over multiple other specialties. But I showed you two papers here, one for neurosurgery and one for otolaryngology, which shows a pretty good correlation between H-index and successful promotion, and it separates out pretty well by assistant, associate, and full professor. So this is me. So the H-index for me is 41, so that means I've had 41 papers cited at least 41 times and 103 at least 10 times. And so that, it also depends on what your interests are. Some people focus on one very narrow area and might have a small number of really high quality papers that get published and cited a lot. And other people might have broad interests, kind of like I do, and you kind of think about lots of different things. Now, the other thing is figure out what the role is that you want to provide to your group and your division, and then what role are they hiring you for. So almost every academic group I've worked with or been part of, or when I travel around, has somebody who's a clinical workhorse. Their job is to take care of patients, teach residents, but that usually won't get you promoted, so you can't just do that. But if you're good at that, that may be your role. You may find a way to serve another way. So you can serve on local and national committees. You can look at working groups. You can look at industry. So I mean that in a good way. How do you develop relationships with industry for your division and your medical school? How do you get involved in research projects? A clinical workhorse can do that kind of stuff, because if you're doing clinical work all the time, you're going to want to do new grafts, new procedures, so you're going to have to develop these relationships. Education is a route now that's become very well accepted, and that fits pretty well with someone who's primarily clinical. So you can be an associate program director, you can run teaching conferences, you can run the medical student program. How do we get more specialists in vascular surgery? Somebody has to reach out to the medical students. You can oversee resident teaching. So all those roles, first of all, you should enjoy doing those. If you like that, then seek them out. But don't pick a role you don't want. Other roles, some people, we can see it in the SVS, how the SVS has changed in the last 10 years. So we have all these committees now doing a lot of work, whereas the SVS used to be a meeting that happened once a year, and some older guys sat up there and the same papers got discussed. So there's a role for people to do business and finance in the division, to look at the billing and coding issues. If you're going to do basic or really advanced translational research, usually you're going to have to do that and have a smaller clinical role, because to really be competitive in that venue, it's hard to do that and have 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 RVUs a year. A general guideline for reaching appropriate targets for promotion is about 5 publications a year, but I don't think you should focus as much on number as you should on quality, because anything you write is going to have your name on it. So it ought to be good, and you ought to be proud of it, and you shouldn't just put stuff out just to get things published. Just kind of finish up here. I think seize opportunities. So when I did vascular in the Air Force, we did a lot of aortas and carotids, and I think I did one tibial artery reconstruction, and we had a busy program, but that's the disease we saw. I trained with John Porter, and I did 100 tibial bypasses as a fellow, and when I came back to the Air Force, everybody said, well, we aren't going to see all those cases here. We don't have them. Well, we had a transplant service. We had a ton of diabetics. We had a lot of smokers, and when I started looking for it, there was a lot of lower extremity disease in our practice, even though it hadn't been looked at before. And it turned out when I finished my fellowship was the year duplex surveillance was kind of invented. So now I'm looking at some other venue for expanding our practice. We have all these legs. Duplex scanning came out. It wasn't what I would have picked from the start of my career, but I kind of fell into it. So I think you should look at those same things when you take a job. Look for things that aren't being done in your group. Look for opportunities to improve yourself and improve your group. Be a team player. Now, we all have to do things sometimes that aren't enjoyable. And so if you work for a circus, you might occasionally have to clean up after elephants. I'll get into that in a minute. But don't assume too many roles that don't match your skill sets or interests, or you'll be unhappy. And if you're unhappy, you're going to make your coworkers unhappy, your friends unhappy, your family unhappy, and life is too short to be unhappy. So don't be content with any role. So if you find yourself after 5 years and you're still the shoveler, you probably assumed a role that you shouldn't have, but pick your battles carefully, so don't give the elephant X-lax in your institution because you're not going to like the result. Finally, this is the paper. It was pretty interesting. It shows that a large number of people that enter academics, in this particular study, it was about 42% when they did a medical school survey, were unhappy and were looking at leaving. And I think the reason for that is pretty complicated, but it's partly the institution, it's partly the department, it's partly the lack of mentorship. But the biggest thing, it's not a proper match. So if your expectations of what academic surgery are like are way different than what it's really like, or what you thought you were going to be able to do, you find yourself blocked every time you want to do it, that's not going to work. So I think when you start thinking about where you are and what you're doing, you ought to reassess yourself periodically, and you ought to rebalance your life, just like you rebalance your investments. So you don't want to be doing that every 5 minutes and be a day trader, but you can't just let things go and roll without making any adjustments, so you'll find yourself unhappy. And I find that the biggest reason why people are unhappy is the expectations they had of the position were not what the position really was. So try to get those defined really early on, and then try to look for opportunities to add additional value to your group. So the match has to be right. So again, no job is perfect, and also be careful with promotions, because you may get promoted into a position that sounds like it's a better position, but it may not be, because all those promotions come with expectations. So if you find yourself in an administrative role when you really want to do clinical surgery and teach residents, you may find yourself unhappy because you're not doing what you're good at and you're not doing what makes you happy. And remember also, there's nothing wrong with being a role player on a really good team. In fact, you can't have a good team if you don't have role players. And also beware of the Peter principle. Don't be a victim. So don't look to constantly get ahead and find yourself in one of those dead-end jobs where you're not doing any of the things that make you happy and you're not doing the things you're good at, because then you won't be happy. And not to get too preachy, but I think try to think about giving too, and not just what you get. So if you find yourself trying to help your coworkers, helping your chairman, helping your division head, giving good care to your patients, trying to give back to the profession that's given us so much, you'll probably get a whole lot more in return than you give with your effort. So that's mostly philosophy, but I think the big messages are try to find out what your talents are, and I encourage all our trainees early on to try everything. Try the vascular lab, try open stuff, try endo, try vein, try clinical research, try everything. Don't limit yourself from the start, and find out what kind of things you seem to have a facility for, and then try to develop those. Don't get too narrow too early. And then when you get somewhere new, always try to contribute. Look for opportunities of things that could be done better, of how you could help your partners, how you could make the service work better, services you could add that aren't offered. And that's, I think, where you're going to find you're going to be happy, and not necessarily aim for one specific thing without looking around. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mills. Our next speaker is Dr. Michael Singh from the University of Pittsburgh, and he's going to tell us a little bit about advancement opportunities and switching jobs.
Good afternoon. These are my disclosures. Evaluating job advancement opportunities can be far more stressful than one might imagine, especially when you weren't planning to make change. As I think about magnitudes of stress, I put getting married, participating in the oral boards, and changing jobs at the top of the list. We as physicians traditionally have fallen back into comfort zones, and when we're pushed to the limit outside of that comfort zone, it increases the degree of anxiety. Too often, while falling back into that comfort zone, we'll often find many reasons not to make change. In this situation, potentially it takes too much work to make a career change. Where am I to begin? Am I too old to make the change? I don't think I have enough skills to participate in a new environment that's unfamiliar to me. I really don't want to climb that academic ladder once again. You can imagine the amount of frustration it'll place upon my family, and probably back to the foundation of this is that I'm afraid to step away from the comfort zone. Well, here are 3 inspirational quotes that I found quite remarkable. The first coming from Wayne Gretzky. You miss 100% of shots that you don't take. That's fairly obvious. John Lennon said, life is what happens to you while you're busy making other plans. But the one statement that really resonates the most, and I thought about when I transitioned 16 months ago, came from Mark Twain. 20 years from now, you'll be more disappointed by the things you didn't do than by the ones you did do. So throw off the bowlines, sail away from the safe harbor, catch the trade winds in your sails, explore, dream, and discover. And to some degree, I use that in my recent transition going from Rochester to Pittsburgh. Now, when it comes to changing jobs, there's a plethora of reasons for defining your motivation to change. Not all of them are inherent to you, but some of them may be. First and foremost, you need to define, is there a problem? Is it a problem with me? Is it with the job? Is it with the boss or possibly employer? Any of which are possible. Is it the right job but the wrong place? Or maybe the wrong people working with you? Financially, is it unrewarding? Is it a dead-end job which lacks potential for growth? Are there 6 seasoned senior vascular surgeons working above you who are never going to let you do an EVAR in your career? That could be problematic. Are you just one of those people who's consistently unhappy, which in turn is represented by the work environment, where there are poor working relations? You find that you're working far too hard. You're not motivated to make change. There are no challenges. You're finding that work is being reassigned away from you because the quality of work you're providing is not up to par. Maybe there's a change in referral patterns, or more problematic, the support personnel who've worked with you in the past are no longer there. Healthcare reform has impacted all physicians within the United States. Maybe technology has passed us by. You're one of those traditional Great Saphnazaine stripper and ligators. Guess what? In 2014, you're not going to last long. And then in turn, I think one of the most problematic ones is changes in leadership, which impacts everybody from the top down. Well, as a father of a 9-year-old and a 10-year-old, I can tell you I've spent more time watching kids' movies and cartoons than I need to. Here are some interesting examples that I thought about, and I came across some of these online. So these are opportunities that you might want to consider changing your job. The first would be Shrek. In this situation, his boss was an ogre, speaking of the donkey, whose work style and overbearing attitude stifled his career. Career development and advancement was very limited. Fairly obvious. How about The Lion King? This is a classic one I just mentioned. Changing the guard at the top spells disasters for favorites of the prior boss, a change in the regime. The Titanic, a good financial topic from the standpoint, your ship has struck an iceberg in the business world, and perhaps this is due to a lack of revenue, maybe lack of support staff, and you are now sinking quickly. Toy Story, this is going back to the veins. Technology is advanced. Consumers now demand new and improved toys, and if you can't provide that, you're not going to last long. The Ice Age, global change happens to all of us, forcing you to retrain, relocate, and restart your career. And the last, most of you are familiar with, poor Mark Sanchez, who is better known as the quarterback with the infamous butt fumble, and then in turn, his general manager continued to profess that he was safe. Well, lo and behold, they draft a new quarterback in the first round, moving Mark Sanchez on his way out the door. So those are situations that you probably should think about looking for a new job. Now, a very profound statement that emanates from 1854 came from Louis Pasteur, and most of you know it as how it's been spun off as chance favors the prepared mind, but the actual statement was, in the fields of observation, fortune favors the prepared mind. True. Now, sudden flashes of insight don't just happen. They're products of preparation. And it takes some time to think about this. And it wasn't until I read an article by Kunios describing the aha moment. It's when the light is turned on, you say, aha, I have the answer to the problem. And normally, in these regular situations that we're handling problems and challenges, the brain functions in a logical step-by-step problem resolution process, no different than if you were going to treat a patient with an appendix or in a situation looking for a new job. But mental preparation involving inward focus for these aha moments is very remarkable due to the fact that most of these events predate the actual aha moment itself. So subconsciously, we are preparing for this change. And I'll state that by keeping an open mind about opportunities, both consciously and subconsciously, you indeed have the opportunity to maximize the possibility of having your own aha moment, and in turn supporting a theory that chance favors the prepared mind. Now, as surgeons, there are many inherent traits that are beneficial for all of us. Probably one of the most important is that we're problem solvers and very adept decision makers. Our skill set includes diagnosing a problem, collecting information, developing alternative ideas, evaluating each idea, selecting the best one, implementing it, and then following up and evaluating our decision-making process. This is important when it comes to looking at career changes or job changes. First and foremost, we like to say that the grass is always greener on the other side. Not the case. So in these situations, when you're faced with a challenging process or problem, you may want to do the same type of introspective review to see what it is you want from your job. Can I fix the problem at hand? Is it a squeaky wheel that needs to be oiled? And if I'm not going to be successful in fixing that wheel, would my problem be different in another venue? Those are questions that I think are critically important for you to ask before you make that change. So when it comes to changing jobs, I'd say set your goals high. What is it you really want? What matters the most to you? Is it time? Is it money? Is it the practice environment? Is it finding new colleagues? Job security, career advancement, academic advancement, possessing a leadership role or a title? Or is it just to satisfy your family and friends? I think all of which are critically important to you. How you organize those will be dependent on your own thought process. When I went to Pittsburgh, here are some of the things that I wanted. I want a brand new fancy endo suite, which we got. My wife wanted a skyline, which you can see on the bottom. My son, who's a sports fanatic, wanted a football team, basketball team, a hockey team, and a baseball team. Well, he got 3 out of 4, and he's quite content with that. But most of all, I'm quite happy because I now have 17 partners who enjoy beer as much as I do. So I've got a good cohort to interact with. Well, when it does come to changing jobs, I think timing is absolutely critical. And you can look at LeBron James, Bosch, Dwayne Wade, and what they've done in a very short period of time. 3 years ago, LeBron James's contract and Chris Bosch's contracts were up. The Miami Heat had a large enough cap space so they could sign both. In turn, what have we seen? We now have a team that's built on a trio of participants who have successfully won 2 NBA championships and are now in the finals for their 3rd consecutive NBA championship. And it was all based on timing. Had not the cap space been available, had not both of their contracts ended at the same time, we may not have seen this unique situation where one team is now playing for 3 consecutive NBA titles. Use your connections, and the SVS meeting itself, the Vascular Meeting, is absolutely fabulous for networking. Take advantage of that. You, as an active job seeker, need to have the attitude of, I am now a door-to-door vacuum cleaner salesperson, primarily because you need to market and advertise yourself. Certainly, you're going to perform due diligence, researching thoroughly to make sure you can minimize the stress and fear not just yourself, but also within your family. Change is inevitable, but you can control change to some degree. Make sure that what you're looking for meets your needs, do a thorough cost-benefit analysis for you and your family, and then just as importantly, you're not the first person to go through this transition. Find a friend, a mentor who's been through the process before. Once again, changing jobs is anxiety-provoking. Starting a new job is anxiety-provoking. You want to minimize the unknown and prevent the situation that you end up in a worse-case scenario than the one you just departed from. So I'll finish it with this. I think one of the most critically important aspects of finding a job is finding the right boss. And I'm very fortunate. I have a fabulous boss. Bosses are leaders, friends, colleagues, confidants, mentors. They supervise with ease, establish a comfortable and rewarding environment for which the staff works collegially together to improve the practice. You're building a team. You find the right person, you put them in the right job. These types of leaders are few and far between. They have the capability of motivating and influencing others beyond their sphere of authority. They're mentors and role models, and just as important, they're friends. They resolve conflicts with a variety of productive methods, and just as important, they have excellent communication skills, which means that they're good listeners, but they also deliver information in a manner that is understood by the recipient. So with that, I will leave it with, here I am, 2014, and I have a wonderful group of physicians who work with me, and I would say that the majority of that emanates from the guy in the middle who's done a remarkable job putting together a group of 18 physicians at this present day and age, and has given me some very sound insight and advice for my future career. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. You know, I thought Shrek was the good guy. He's good at heart, at least. Our next speaker is Dr. Will Brown, who's going to give us some legal advice on contract negotiation.
Well, thank you very much, Ravi. Thank you for the invitation here to speak this afternoon. My disclosures are that I am, in fact, a partner in the Healthcare Contract Group, which is a law firm that focuses solely on the review and evaluation of medical employment contracts. Because I also am a lawyer, I always have disclaimers when I give a legal talk. The disclaimers are, one, first of all, the law is what the judge and the jury say it is. Number two, all aspects of the law are potentially subject to interpretation. But, however, there are some black and white concepts that we can sort of hang our hats on. Obviously, anybody who's involved dealing with contract negotiations know that it can be a very stressful kind of situation. And this really what contract used to be. You go in there and you needed a job, somebody needed to hire you, you'd shake hands, you'd have a job. Obviously, this is not the way things are done or should be done today. And in fact, they probably shouldn't have been done like this years gone by. Samuel Goldwyn said, "A verbal contract isn't worth the paper that it's written on." So, an agreement between two people, a contract, should be what the legally speak of is a meeting of the minds. You need to understand every single term in that agreement. And you got to decide which terms are negotiable for you and which ones are not negotiable. There is no such thing as an ironclad agreement. It just doesn't exist. I have people who come to me and they say, you know, I can't stand this guy I'm going to go work for, but my spouse really wants to be here and it's a great position and I like, you know, just give me an ironclad contract so I can't end up in trouble. It doesn't exist. So if you don't like the guy, don't work for him. An agreement is only as good as the two people that sign that contract. Okay, there are various types of agreements. Obviously, you can have agreement between you and a private practice group, between you and a hospital, and you and a medical school. Now, you can also have partnerships and you can have corporations. Now, partnerships you have to be a little bit careful of, because if you have a partner, a true partner, you're personally liable for all debts that he incurs under that partnership. So if your partner says, you know, I always wanted to have a jet, he goes out and buys a jet and can't make the payments on that jet, you're legally responsible for that personally. So you got to be careful about true partnerships. Then there are limited liability corporations that you can join, C corporations, and S corporations. Okay, now a limited liability corporation is really what we like, in that you have no liability for malpractice for any of the other members of the corporation. Everybody is separate, and that's a limited liability corporation. You have C corporations, and the C corporation, the money goes to the corporation, and then it's dispersed out to the various members of the corporation. The problem is that the corporation itself has to pay taxes. So not only are you paying personal taxes, the corporation itself is paying taxes. So you're sort of getting double tax there. And finally, there's the S corporation, which most private practice corporations are. The money flows directly through into the partners. Now, when you set up these agreements, there are considerations. There are financial considerations, there are political considerations, and there are legal considerations. All right, as far as financial considerations, obviously, what you want to know is how much you're going to be paid. Obviously, that's the first financial consideration. You got to consider how is it going to be determined, as Dr. Kent has gone over for us. Bonuses, how is that going to be determined? The length of the agreement, what's going to happen when you retire, and how do they take care of that? Benefits, vision, dental, just general health benefits. And what can be run through the corporation. And what I mean by that is that now you get out, you want to be a member of a country club. Well, you can pay some of this, some of your expenses at the country club from the corporation. You can't pay dues, but you can pay some of the expenses from the corporation. And you use it as a professional promotion. Now, that usually goes on in private practice. I don't think it goes on at universities, but I'll let Dr. Ozaki talk about it, whether or not they can run their country clubs through the universities. Maybe Dr. Mills or Dr. Kemp want to talk about that. As far as the special financial considerations, obviously accounts receivable. Do you have to buy into the accounts receivable? How is that going to work? There's a thing called goodwill. Some practices, when you buy in, they say you owe us so much money for goodwill. I know Dr. Samson and I both agree that this is really something that I think almost should be a deal breaker. But again, everybody has to make their own decision about that. There will be hard assets to look at in the group that you're joining. There will be liabilities of the group. You want to look into the financial stability of the hospital and or the practice. If you're joining a practice, they say, we're going to pay you $5 million a year. And then after 3 months, they say, you know what, we can't pay you anything. We just ran out of money. That's not going to do you any good. So you need to make sure that you look into the stability of both. Same thing with the hospital. Hospital is going into trouble too. So you want to make sure you're going into a stable situation. And you also want to have somewhere in the contract about termination. What's going to happen if you're out? How are you going to value that practice, and what's your buyout going to be? You got to look into the liabilities. When you get involved in a practice, look under the hood. Have an accountant take a look at the books. You got to value the hard assets. If there's a whole bunch of, and they say, well, you owe us so much for the duplex machines. If those have all been devalued already and depreciated down, then you really don't owe them anything for that. So you got to look into those kind of things. And again, you got to do an analysis of the retirement plan, distribution upon the retirement and termination of the agreement. There are political considerations. If, say, you're in practice, and now you say, well, I'm going to join the hospital. I'm tired of this. As Dr. Kent said, we're all going to be working for hospitals. I'm going to join the hospitals. How's that going to affect your referral physicians? Are they going to stop sending you cases? What about other institutions? You're employed by one institution. Can you still work at another institution and generate income there for the hospital and for yourself? Other private practice groups, how are they going to, once you cross over to what's affectionately referred as the dark side, over to working for a hospital, and you've been in private practice, how are they going to look upon that? And you need to take that into consideration. And again, the last thing I sort of mentioned is voting rights. And what I mean by voting rights is, now you're going to join a group, whether it's private practice or academics. How are you going to add new partners? You just get added in. Now the group says, well, we want to add another guy. Well, you don't want another guy. So you want to make sure you understand, how is that going to happen? You also want to know, since you're in, you want to find out how can they kick you out. So you want to know about the deletion of partners. How's that going to be? And who's going to vote on that? And does everybody have equal votes? You want to know about voting on salaries and bonuses. You want to know about what if they sell the group to the hospital? What happens then? And finally, the general direction of the group. What you don't want to do is join, say, a private practice group, and now you're in and you're a member of the group, and the group says, by the way, we're going to be opening up a new outpatient angio suite and a vein clinic, and we're going to expanding. Each of us is going to put $500,000 into the group to get this all done. Now, you've just signed up for this. You want to be careful that you at least know the direction that your group's going before you sign up for these kind of things. Covenants not to compete, these are always included in these kind of contracts. Basically, they're based upon the length of time, the restricted area, restricted activities, damages, the relief. If you continue to practice in an area where you have signed a covenant not to practice, you can get injunctive relief, which means they can stop you from practicing, or monetary relief. Now, as far as covenants not to compete, many contracts will have in them defensive language. Defensive language legally means you sign the contract and it says, I agree that this covenant is reasonable, and I agree that if I leave and stay in town, I am going to irreparably damage this group, and I will pay all their legal fees if I do this, and I will pay them so much money in liquidated damages. Obviously, these are not the kinds of things that I would advise that somebody sign on for. And these really should be taken out, these defensive language. A restrictive covenant, really, it has to be reasonable in scope, regard to time, activity, and geographic reach. It's based upon the court. The court decides whether or not it's legal or not legal. And finally, these are very expensive to litigate. Legal considerations. You want to make sure that when you're signing these contracts, you don't just assume, well, this all must be legal because they're having me sign this. You got to make sure that, in fact, it is legal. You could be violating Stark laws. You could be violating false claims and anti-kickback statutes. If the job looks too good to be true, it probably is. STAR clause, just real quickly to remind you, it prohibits a physician from referring patients to an entity if the physician or family member has a financial relationship with the entity. It really basically prohibits that entity also from submitting a bill for that. So, the purpose of the STAR clause obviously is to prevent overutilization of services by physicians who could profit by referring patients to facilities in which they have a financial interest. So what happens if you do that? Well, obviously they're not going to pay the claim. And the second thing is, if you do this and you present this bill, you will be fined $15,000 each time you do that. Now, if you get together with a lawyer and you sort of work together and he says, you know, I think we can probably get around it by doing this, and the government thinks that you did that, now it costs you $100,000 per claim. They have no sense of humor about that. So an example is, if you have a vascular surgery group, you divide up the profit from the vascular lab, all members of the group may receive a bonus from the profits. But the amount of the bonus can't be based upon how many referrals you sent to the vascular lab. So therefore, in conclusion, first of all, litigating a partnership agreement dispute is very, very expensive. And oftentimes the winner is still a loser. And therefore, the basic principle in all this, if you don't trust your partner, don't sign. And again, use common sense with these things. The fact that a lawyer advised you such conduct doesn't relieve it sometime of its foolishness. Again, thanks a lot for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much. Our next speaker is Dr. Keith Ozaki from Brigham and Women's Hospital, who's going to talk to us about contract negotiations and academic practice.
I too appreciate the invitation to participate in this forum. So I'm going to give you my perspective, and like many of the prior speakers, I'm going to upfront apologize. This is not my usual kind of data-driven talk, and in fact, this is one that is very Ozaki-centric. That is, this is based a lot on my own personal experience. I've been in academia now 18 years or so. Most of the fellows I've trained have gone into academic practices, and I've kind of heard their experiences, and that's been weaved into this presentation. At the University of Florida and at the Brigham, I've been involved in hiring several new faculty members. And then I did spend several years as a VA chief of surgery at a time when the physician pay bill came out, and we were transferring off these fee-for-service lines into actually hiring academic surgeons. And so that also gave me a perspective, and I want to spend one of my slides actually talking about early careers in the VA. I want to go over first, though, some very general principles. And I want to really emphasize what, from my perspective, should really be your primary considerations as you start to talk about an academic job. And the real question is this a fertile academic environment for my growth? And will this negotiation handle those perceived barriers? This is not all about the finances. It really is about your personal and professional success. It is not an adversarial process, and if it starts becoming an adversarial process, I really should encourage you to pause, and I think that really was emphasized by the other speakers. Both sides certainly should expect and demand a fair, reasonable commitment to mutual success. Another thing is vascular surgery is a very small family, and I can give you several anecdotes of people that have come out and had very unusual demands or had things really break apart. And we review each other's papers. Relationships are long-term. Sometimes you'll interview for a position, 10 years later you may be back working to get a job with that group. So you really have to be professional throughout the entire process. Also realize that you're asking for precious resources whenever you come into a group. Everybody is going to have to subsidize your early career, and those resources come from your partner. There's nothing worse than going into a group and you've sucked the life out of the group. And then finally, the expectation from the department is they want to have some sort of win in the scenario, and so any investment they put into you, they're going to expect a return on that investment. If you want $500,000 as a startup package for basic research, you better have a return on that investment, or you're not going to be perceived positively by the department. So moving forward with that, thinking about things from the department and the division's perspective, I think that's an important way to start thinking about an academic contract negotiation. Sometimes you can get a lot of background just from the historical context. And many practices, especially if it's a public state institution, actually you may have a lot of public information out there. You can sometimes talk to recent hires. In a University of Florida, they actually would publish your salary in the paper, and you kind of know what the other recent hires were making, at least on a fiscal side. At the Brigham and Women's, they make you sign a document that says, I will never talk about this to anyone. The AAMC is often used as a benchmark, and you want to kind of see what ledgers are publicly available. You also have to be practical about things. In the current environment, many times you have to do a pro forma. You have to argue to the dean how this new hire will be a business win for the institution, and parts of that contract may be non-negotiable. Same thing for the VA once the job description is set. I think it's important to look at a department or division and really figure out what they need. And this has been emphasized by several other speakers. You can't be a utility person. They have a certain need, and you have to think about what you do well and what you bring to the table. You need to be a well-prepared team member that can really fit a defined role. And then I really want you to thoroughly assess your interests, what you really want to do, and really make sure it's a good match for the group's needs. And then finally, take an example of if you really want to do outcomes research, and there's only 3 good outcomes research jobs in the academic community that year, yet you have 30 applicants. That really does change the perspective from the hiring university's perspective. I think another very important thing that needs a little bit of comment is time, and making sure everybody understands what you're going to do with your time. And to understand how you would spend your time, you have to know the clinical practice and the academic group structure. How do they actually preserve time? What are the expectations whenever you make up things for vacations and meeting travels? You also really understand what they need. I've looked at positions sometimes, and they really want you to start up a research lab, but they actually look at the clinical practice, and the group really needs to hire 3 clinical surgeons. They are getting overwhelmed with work. And so look at your OR covers. What are the details of the schedule? And then another big fork in the road in various practices is how do they actually do the work? Sometimes there's a team of clinicians and you cross-cover each other's patients. That's very good at protecting time for certain academic initiatives. Other times you're always kind of on call for your own patients, and that can be a little destructive as that grant deadline approaches. Really understand also in the various universities the impact of your percent effort on grant eligibility, promotion, and tenure. And to say I'm going to be 60% research, yet when you go for associate professor, you've only had 2 or 3 research papers, that's going to look a little funny. So you really have to align things on paper with where you're going to be productive. And overall, even though what they say will come into all the language of what you think about, the culture of the practice and the clinical realities of the practice will certainly dominate over those words. As you start to look for jobs, you'll see a lot of different opportunities, and certainly the social considerations will tend to dominate things. Where does your family want to live? Big city, small city? Think about what life stage you're in. And you'll see very large discrepancies in the salary sometimes. Oh, this institution offers me a very big salary. But if you actually drill down, you've got to pay your own malpractice. You've got to think about your retirement and pay separately from that. So really understand what those numbers mean and what's covered and what's non-covered in it. There is, as you know by Dr. Kent's talk, several bonus systems and things like that that may come into play. Know what they want to measure, how they're going to measure it, and how it impacts your incentives. Some places let you have parallel income, others don't. Certainly the cost of living can dramatically impact the power of your dollar that you bring home for your family and friends. And then think about not only that initial phase of your life, but in the midterm and late career, what happens? Do people's salaries drop as their clinical productivity goes down? And at the end of the career, if you were to move, are there ways that you could actually get credit for the amount of time that you haven't taken that vacation, sick leave, etc.? One of the things that was important for me as I thought about a big mid-career move to Boston is, what are my parallel opportunities? If things don't work out, would I have to then remove my family again? I said, oh no, there are several other institutions where I think I could maybe have a successful career. And certainly there's those upfront initial events, and these all need to be considered. Often there's a signing bonus, but if you're going to have something like that for the VA, it needs to be in that initial announcement. And you can see a list of things here that really matter. One quick thing is everybody thinks about how much startup money do I really need for my lab, and many times I see early career surgeon scientists make mistakes in buying some fancy piece of equipment or thinking they're going to be able to hire and retain a technician in a very difficult job market. It's hard to know what you really need, and I encourage people to pause, work a little while, and then really know what you really need. Get under the wing of an established investigator. They really like having someone young who has a lot of energy. It's some of the easiest money that PI will be able to get. And certainly you can use a lot of their equipment and technical expertise to do things. Labs constantly close down, and when they close down, there's equipment. We call them fire sales at the VA. You could go in, really find very inexpensive equipment. And then as you think about your long-term research strategies, if you're going to base all your scientific assays on a primate model, understand you're setting yourself up for a very expensive research career that may not be practical. And then finally, sometimes there are certain things that you'll need a degree to actually be successful early career, an MPH or something like that. Is the group willing to negotiate and cover your tuition and time for that? Finally, a little bit about the VA. The VA, as you know, will have a tour duty, and you can be full-time, which is a preferred way to do things these days, but they also can be quite flexible. You can be full-time and have an altered tour and work 4 days a week at the VA and 1 day at the university. If you're part-time, you're going to need to do time sheets. You have to be very careful in this day and age. VAs can really pay you up to what the president makes, and so the salary is set by a physician pay board, so don't get discouraged if you feel like you're not going to be compensated well in the VA. They're willing to pay, especially in this day and age when they need good quality physicians. The career advancement on a research fund is actually quite enticing in the VA right now. Career development awards pay about 3/4 of your salary for up to 3 years, and you can participate in clinical research initiatives such as cooperative studies trials. There are all sorts of little subtle local nuances in the VA pay scale related to the university, but it really is worth investigating whenever you have a component of your practice that may be at the VA. And there are also the advantages about separate retirement accounts in the VA research foundations that are separate from your dean and department chairman, where you control the money more directly. So in summary, as I think about this, I'd say most contemporary academic contract negotiations are really largely bounded by recent precedents and resources, and they have to think about whatever they do for you, they may have to do for the next hire, but they really should be rationally tailored for your individual and the institutional success. This package is in a lot of ways, to me, sometimes oversold, and really the determinant of your career satisfaction and your success is that institution's commitment. And one of my favorite sayings came from the first person that hired me, Dr. Ted Copeland at University of Florida. When I was negotiating, do I get $15,000 or $20,000 to start my lab, he shook my hand and said, "You're not going to fail here for fiscal reasons." And I knew University of Florida was committed to helping me get going. And your primary objective, I think, is really to find the right group and be the best fit for their needs and your personal and professional goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith. Our last speaker is Dr. Russell Samson, who runs one of the most successful private practices, and he will share with us contract negotiations in private practice. Which is the one or the page down.
Yeah, thank you. So for those of you that don't know me, I've been in academic practice for about 8 years. I was Frank Veith's second fellow. I did survive that, by the way, as I'm still standing here as one of the older people. But having moved from academics into private practice, my disclosure is I'm the senior partner in a private practice, and we are never selling to the hospital, which we consider the big ogre in medicine at the moment, and I'll be happy to discuss that during the panel discussion. So for those of you that are out there looking for a job in private practice, I think many of you think that you're just going to not get a job at all, and you're going to be on the sidewalk waiting for us to pick you up. And then there are the others who think that we're just waiting for you, we can't wait for you to join our practices, and we're just going to give you lots of money to come and join us. Those people deserve a reality check. So I think what you have to realize is, why do we in a community practice hire you if you're going to join us? And it's for our benefit, not for yours. And as soon as you realize that, you'll be a good supplicant in the process. And I use the word supplicant very carefully. So why are we hiring you? Well, often it's to replace a retiring surgeon, to expand our market penetration into other hospitals, to preempt another practice or hospital from expanding in our area. Sometimes we're trying to bring on a new hospital. Most of the time it's so that we can have more vacation time and time off because we have a tremendous workload that we're trying to alleviate. If you think that you're joining us because you have a skill that we are missing, I can assure you that is not the case. In most community practices these days, everybody can do everything. When I went into private practice, which was a long time ago, as Gibbs said, I am one of the older people. I joined the town in Sarasota and said, I can do a distal bypass. Nobody here can do a distal bypass. I can't really remember when I did a distal bypass these days. When our newest partner came in, he said, well, I can do endovascular procedures. Now I think everybody can do endovascular procedures. So realistically speaking, we can do everything, and you are there mainly for our benefit. We're not hiring you because you're unemployed. We're hiring you, as I said, because we need somebody to help us with our workload. Furthermore, you're not going to be the financial windfall to the practice. At best, when you join us, we will make about the same amount of money as we did before. So don't think that you're going to be joining us so that we can just make a lot of money. And on top of it, when we do hire you, you're going to be hired really before we really need you. So usually when you come into the practice, you're going to have to develop your own practice within the private practice environment. You'll have to develop your own referrals. And on top of it, since we're talking about the contract is usually going to be designed for our benefit, not for your benefit. So just remember that, and because of that, you better know what the employment contract is about. You've heard multiple people speak, and Bill Brown speak about this, but this is going to be a binding agreement between you and the people that are hiring you for the term of the contract, so you better know about how this contract can be terminated. The other thing, as you've heard from Dr. Brown, is the entity that's hiring you is usually going to have a lawyer, so you should have a lawyer yourself. And I know Bill Brown is a lawyer. He runs a company. I'm sure he'd be happy to help you out. And his children need some money, so please use him if you're going to be using anybody. But just because the lawyer says that you need to do something doesn't mean that you have to follow their advice, but pay attention to what you say. But I think have your own ideas as to what you want and what you don't want, and sometimes you don't have to take everything that the lawyer says. So you do have to know what's going to be in the contract, and a lot of the things have already been described, so because of time, I'll go through this pretty quickly. You're going to be discussing the duties and performances that you have to do, how often you're going to have to be on call. There'll be issues about the qualifications and licenses that you're going to have. There are going to be rules about local politics and regulations and policies with the practice. There's going to be determination about the fee and accounting and how you're going to have the money come to you. There's going to be regulations about how you can accept patients. There will be issues about death and disability and limitations of the authority over you, and of course confidentiality. Most importantly in the contract is how you can be fired, and I would pay special attention to that in this particular contract, because many people do join a group and are fired after the first year. The other thing that you need to understand is when you join a group, you'll be signing an employment agreement which will be for the first 1 to 3 years. But thereafter, if you're going to want to stay with the practice, you're going to have to sign a partnership agreement. So the employment contract and a partnership agreement and partnership contract are totally different, and you should really look at the partnership agreement as well, even though you will not be signing it as you join the practice. So this is a completely different legal document than your employment agreement. You must review this before you sign the employment agreement, and again, before you actually make that partnership decision. The other issue that obviously most people are interested in is the salary. We would like to point out that it's not just the salary that you should be looking at, it should be all the other benefits that you've heard from all the other speakers. So what will be your pension if you ultimately join the partnership? How much time are you going to get off? And what type of reimbursement are you going to get for the various expenses that you have? So these are the things that you need to understand. Will they be paying for continuing education? Will they be paying for you to come to a meeting such as this? Are they going to pay for your medical licenses, your dues, your subscriptions to medical magazines? If you have to relocate from Boston down to Florida where we are, will we pay for your relocation expenses, or will you have to pay for it yourself? Are they going to market you in the community? That's very important. You come into the community, there's no work. Are they going to put an ad in the newspaper to say that you've joined the practice? Are they going to hand out flyers to the referring doctors? Are they going to give dinners or lectures to show that you're in the community? Are they going to pay for your car, for your cell phone? What about health insurance? And is there going to be a cap on expenses? You're going to need to know about time off, especially the women. Are you going to get pregnancy leave? Are you going to get paternity leave? And what about CME? Malpractice insurance is critical. Is the group going to pay for your malpractice insurance? Well, most groups will, but the question you have to ask for is, are they going to pay for tail? Now, tail is not something that you get when you chase women at a bar. Tail is a very important issue here. And tail is going to be, can make or break you. Tail is for the insurance that you get if you happen to leave the practice. So if you do have a disagreement with this practice and you leave after 2 years and you don't have tail insurance, you can be in tremendous financial difficulty. You should ask for this and they should pay for it. There are going to be limitations as to outside employment. Can you moonlight? Can you consult for another practice? Can you consult for industry? Can you do malpractice reviews? And can you work outside of your specialty? Some practices will limit you entirely to only working for their practice. If you're inventive and you come up with a new device, are the royalties going to belong to you or are they going to belong to the practice? That's one of the problems that I left academic practice, because where I was in Einstein, if you came up with an idea, it belonged to the university, not to us. But that can happen even in a contract negotiation with a community practice. We did do a survey from some fellows that come to a course that we run at the end of October, and we found out that the starting salary was between $225,000 to $350,000. A lot of people expected that it would be above $400,000, and actually one person was getting that. But we think the average salary is going to be somewhere between what I'm showing you here. Of the people that we surveyed, 10 out of 15 got a signing bonus when they were offered a practice, and 14 of the 15 people actually got moving expenses. So you should ask for these things if you're going to negotiate a contract. As far as a bonus is concerned, a lot of practices will give you more money based on productivity, so you have to know, is it actually realistic that you can achieve this bonus? And if they say yes, then I would definitely ask someone else in the practice to make sure that it actually happened. The salary. So originally your salary is going to be somewhat low. As I've said, it takes time for the practice to make money from you, and the hiring entity is really gambling that we are going to make money from you. So the original salary is going to be on the low side. I don't think you should necessarily fixate on what that original salary is. Certainly some practices will ask you to actually buy into the practice. You should never buy into the practice. Your buy-in should be the time that you spend becoming a partner. In general, we think that you should rather look at what you're ultimately going to make, not what you're going to make at the beginning. So, for example, if the salary for the first 3 years is $200,000 a year, but then your partner's salary is $900,000, is that better than getting a salary of $250,000, $350,000, $450,000 over 3 years, but then your ultimate salary is only $400,000? By the way, as you just heard, the average salary for a vascular surgeon in the country is $450,000. That must be one of these academic surgeons that are sitting at the podium. The rest of us are making a fraction more. Anybody want to know what that fraction is? I will not tell you. As far as term for this original contract, usually it's 1 to 3 years, but again, you need to know what it's going to be at the end, and is it going to terminate automatically, or does it go on and on ad infinitum? Will there be a partnership agreement? And if your contract is going to be terminated, how can it be terminated? I've put in here, beware of this thing in a contract that says that you weren't acting professionally or responsibly. That is a way for the practice to get you out. If there's that type of wording, get rid of it. There will be this restrictive covenant. You've already heard Bill talking about the restrictive covenant. Most of us agree that you should never sign a contract agreement with a restrictive covenant. So if they want you to have a restrictive covenant and you agree to it, make sure that it works to your advantage. It should be limited to a geographical area over a short distance. There shouldn't be a long time commitment to the restrictive covenant, but basically I wouldn't sign one if they ask you to sign one. Ownership of medical records is important. If you're going to leave the practice for any reason, you need to know that the patients can come with you. As far as goodwill is concerned, that's already been discussed, so I'm not going to go into it. So in summary, I think you need to carefully choose the best long-term practice for you, where you are going to be most happy over a long period of time. You've heard this from everybody else, emotionally, financially, medically, and academically. We believe that if you're going to negotiate in a practice, you should take the word negotiation out of your vocabulary. It's rather an agreement between you and the other people, with your lawyer, with their lawyer, coming to some type of agreement where you know that you will be happy, where they'll be happy, and you can have a productive relationship. So in general, the contract, as far as we're concerned, does not solve the problems. It creates a framework to argue if you ever come to disagree. Hopefully that will never happen. As the real agreement is really the handshake, but the handshake should also definitively involve a lawyer. And finally, if you're applying to our group, I'd appreciate if you disregard everything that I've said.
I'm sure many of you have questions. Please come up and take advantage of our panel. Maybe I'll start with the first question to Gib. So I'm going to try to use some of your language. What do you do when you are trying to be synergistic, but your cardiologist or radiologist or maybe cardiac surgeon wants to be competitive? How do you handle that?
So I think one of the things you do is you encourage them to get to the VQI. You say, if you're going to do carotid endarterectomy, that's great. Why don't you just enter your data into the VQI? So I'm going to stay on the high road with this whole quality issue. I think the other thing you could do, and we did this at Michigan, was you could have a preoperative conference to review all the cases. You just can't. I'm not advocating giving anything away, because vascular surgeons always win. But those are my two things: database and sort of preoperative conference, focusing on the patient.
So I'll comment on that. I think that you have to live in this world, and this world has other specialists that do vascular intervention. So you can, as Gibbs said, create a threshold that they have to get beyond in terms of quality, volume, to be able to participate in that world. But once they've superseded that threshold, you have to live with those cardiologists and other interventionalists. That's just the way it is. And in some ways, you ought to stop thinking about them as a cardiologist, but another competitive vascular surgeon, right? We compete with other vascular surgeons in our regions, in our practices. So I don't, I have been as involved in the turf issues over the years as anyone, as a division chief and then as a department chair. But ultimately, you have to recognize if somebody has the skill set, they do it really well, they're going to be part of this as much as we are.
Dr. Samson, do you agree?
I just want to tell you about a quote that I'm push around, and that is, a vascular center of excellence is any hospital that does not have a cardiologist.
That's nice. Sapan?
It's actually interesting, because I'm just going to take a little bit of offense at that. And the only reason is because I run a cardiovascular center, and our peripheral vascular disease volume is actually quite low. And it's mainly low because the cardiologists in the outside referral area are doing an amazing amount of PAD. And so with us not having a cardiologist, I know this is like sacrilege here, and I'll probably never aspire to anything in the SVS again, but just remember, I'm talking like a director of a cardiovascular center. Without us having a cardiologist that other cardiologists will refer to, they don't send the cases in. So that's just an alternative, non-vascular surgery centric view.
In some ways it's true. I get PAD referrals from this cardiologist, but he gets the referrals himself for revascularization, but he cannot handle it. So I never get it from the source, which is another cardiologist, but through a filter. Zapan?
Thank you. I really enjoyed the talks this evening, and thank you for the time you took to prepare them. I'm a going to take this rare opportunity to poll 9 members here. I'm joining a new academic practice in a month, and I'm very curious about this magic formula for promotion. Papers, first author, last author, the so-called triple or quadruple threat towards really making a name for yourself in a university-type setting. What advice do you have for someone who's starting out and wants to do the best he can? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a little hard to answer. So the triple threat's gone, I think. I mean, other people can address that. But I think in today's world, it's almost impossible to be a triple threat. So, but you have to be a dual threat. You can't just do one thing. So if you don't do a lot of basic science, you can still do clinical research, and you should do good clinical research. And the other track is to do clinical work plus teaching, and education is starting to be taken seriously. But you can't be a single threat. I mean, if all you can do is bunt, you're not going to get to bat very much in a baseball game, right? So I don't like sports analogies, but you should try to develop multiple pathways that make you useful, not just one thing. So, but it's unrealistic. If you're going to try to compete for NIH grants and be the busiest guy in your practice and do all the teaching and read the vascular labs, it's not going to happen. It's just there's not enough time to do all that. And you're also not going to be the best person at fenestrateds and tibials and retrograde pedal access. And so you got to pick what you do, but you need to do more than one thing. So you have to be a dual threat, would be my answer to that.
So let's say that you're thinking about switching jobs or looking for another job. How should you handle that situation with your current boss?
I'll take that on. I've been in that situation a number of times, both as a division chief and as a department chair. I think that I mean, the right answer when you're in a leadership role is I love transparency. I mean, from my standpoint, everyone should always explore, and particularly as you grow, and perhaps the environment you're in doesn't allow you to grow to the next level, then you have to look at other places to grow to the next level. So transparency, I think, is my answer to that question. And so many people explore. They find out, as somebody mentioned, the grass isn't greener, or it is, and but often it's not, and then they come back. And so being upfront about it, I think, is a very positive thing to do. Now, that could be a little idealistic, right? Because there are some leaders or partners that might take offense to the fact that you're looking at. I don't think that's the right approach, but some people are that way. So there are a number of individuals that maybe on the first look, won't let their partners or their leader know about it. But I think when you get to the point that you're actually serious about the position, the smartest thing you can do is walk into, if you're in academics, your chair's office or your division chief's office or your partner's office and say, hey, I'm looking at this, I'm not sure it's what I want. But I think transparency is really important.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that, and I think that the worst thing that could happen would be that they find out and you didn't say anything. As a chairman, that would bother me the most. If I found out that somebody was looking, somebody came up to me and say, hey, I hear your partner's looking for a job, they came to me and they've gone to 5 other people, and you never talked to me about it, I would find that troubling. That would sort of bother me. So I would agree that it's best to just sort of be upfront about it.
The rule of thumb is that you can look the first time for free. And the issue is whether you're actually looking to actually improve. I mean, whether you're looking because you're unhappy with the job you've got or whether you've got a glass ceiling. I think, I see John in the back. We both looked at jobs before we took our current division chief jobs. And the reason was because there was a glass ceiling where I was. I loved the University of Michigan. I still love the University of Michigan. But there was a guy on top of me and a guy on top of him, and it was literally, I had just basically exhausted everything I could do there. That's not to say there was anything wrong with the University of Michigan. So it's just sort of, I think the other thing is if you stay put, especially if you're sort of at a pivotal time in your career, if you're moving from assistant to associate professor, the resources that you can accrue with the move, especially academic resources, are going to be greater if you move. You're never going to get the same resources at home, and I know that's sort of pathetic. It's about re-recruitment.
That's unless you threaten to leave, and then you get those resources.
Yeah,
I
I have
think you
two
should-
quick comments related to this. Number one, I do think if you get an opportunity to go look at a job, it's a great experience, and it actually may help you better compare future jobs down the road if the right match were to come up with you. So I'd say be transparent, I agree, and do it. You also have to think once again that this is a small community, and you want to help your partners, the group that you're leaving, with their succession planning and things like that. So early in the process, if you really are considering it, show them that courtesy. And then finally, I'd say the really good leader that has another institution who's interested in you should be very proud if you really have the right boss. And I think that would, your success is really also their success.
Yeah, I think that's true. What I was going to say is what Keith had said earlier. It's a small community, so if you don't tell your chairman or division chief, it's very likely if you've looked more than glanced somewhere that person on the other end may call and say, hey, I just wanted to let you know that we're looking at Karen. Did you know about it? And you don't want that to happen, because then I think it's better just to be transparent. So if you're pretty happy and you come across somebody that says, hey, we have this opportunity, you think, well, I'll just look at it. Then I would if one of my people told me that, I'm fine with that. If you're unhappy, it's an opportunity to sit down. If you can't sit down with the person you work for and tell them, I've been working pretty hard, but these are the issues, can you help me with them? And you get no answer, or you can't get an appointment, there's a message there, right? Then you shouldn't be afraid to say, I'm looking either, because I've brought these issues to your attention. So I think being transparent is pretty good. Certainly, if you glance at a job, I'm not sure you need to mention that. And if it's a really toxic environment where you are, maybe you should keep it quiet for longer. But generally, I think being upfront's best.
So, Dr. Kent, does threatening to leave get you resources? What if they tell you, okay, you can leave? Should you be prepared to leave?
Oh, yeah, yeah. No, that's a really good point. This isn't something that you want to bluff about, because if you start negotiating, it's possible that your home institution may wish you well. So I think that's true. But I've had people over the years that have looked at other opportunities that provide them more resources, and I've sat down logically and said, they can go there with more resources, but they're an absolute star. I don't want them to leave, and I'll ante the resources to keep people to stay. So I think don't use that as a strategy, because I think people that use that as a strategy are probably going to lose. But if you actually are looking at another position because it gives you more resources and your home institution ante's up, then you've got two great choices. So if you're doing it for the right reasons, I think it'll work out.
Thank you once again for this informative session. I'm Siavash Sadat from Rutgers Robert Wood Johnson, one of the general surgery residents. Question would be, have you noticed any difference in hiring patterns for the residents or fellows coming out of the integrated programs versus the ones that are going through general surgery track and then fellowship?
Well, it's still pretty early, right? Because we just barely have graduates, but I don't perceive that's going to be an issue. The limitation will be, but it's changed. But it used to be some practices would hire you, and there was still an expectation you would do some general surgery until your practice developed. But when I was head of the APDVS a few years ago, we actually polled. This was probably 5 years ago, and most people weren't even looking for that type of job anymore. So vascular had already kind of differentiated itself. But I don't think, I've looked at the skill. I have 05s now. We'll have our first graduate this year, and there's not one of them I wouldn't hire. And there's actually a couple I'm thinking about hiring. So from my standpoint, we put a lot of effort into that pathway, so I would feel like it was a failure if we didn't think those people would be good, and they are good.
So from a practical standpoint, though, we have a 05, and our most senior person is just going into her 5th year, but she's looking around now, and so I've gotten about 6 phone calls from different places that she's looked at, and she's an absolute star, and better than, or as good as any fellow that I've ever trained. So I agree with Joe. I think the 05 programs are producing really great people, but every place that's called me and has said, she's in one of those 05 programs. Do you think she's going to be a good surgeon? So I do think that we're in the exploration phase where people that are recruiting are going to kind of try to figure out in their own mind whether somebody's equally well trained coming out of a 05 than a 5.2. So I wouldn't be surprised if that question comes up. You just have to make sure if you're in a 05 that you're well trained and that your mentors are going to give the right answer to that question, which I did in her case. But it's on people's mind.
At the Brigham and Women's, we have stayed with the traditional 5-2, and often our trainees did 7 years in general surgery. And it is a market out there, and so we feel very confident that our trainee graduating will have a competitive edge whenever they go out and look at jobs. And I do agree with Dr. Kent, there is that added security of this is someone who's a little bit more surgically mature, has been to this, and there's a long track record. So I think you have to consider that as you look at these programs. There are many excellent ones out there, but we feel very proud of our product in a 5-2.
But I will respond and say that, Joe and I are thinking the same way. I think the products of the 0-5 programs are superb, excellent, and given another 3 or 4 years when a number of these individuals get out into practice, people are going to see that there isn't a difference. And so even though there's some temerity at this point of time, I mean, I think ultimately I wouldn't worry about that if you were trying to make a choice as a medical student, whether to go to a 0-5 or a 5-2 program. I just don't think that should be part of the equation.
So I've spoken to a number of people in community practice, and there's definitely a prejudice against the 5-year program, but I think it's not realistic because we have looked at it as well. If you were to join us, whether you came out of a 5-year or a 7-year program, the first year we would operate 100% with you. On a toe amputation, we would be there. So it really doesn't make any difference. If you have the skill set, you've done the work, whether you've come out of 5 or 7-year program makes no difference. But you will find, I think, amongst the community group, a slight prejudice against the 5-year program.
I have a question regarding the employee position. So I'm reaching the stage that I start to window shopping and go through the job postings. I'm starting 4th year, end of my 4th year, 0-5. So when I look at, there's no shortage of job posts, but almost very rarely they actually list the salary information. But so for me, the application process, it seems to be very involved. So before I commit myself, I'd like to have some sort of screening or filter mechanism so I can be more selective in the places I visited. So why the salary information is not posted? Secondly, just for the economics question. So if a place will offer a fixed salary, let's say we saw $400,000 with an expected RVU of 8,000. How much? What does an 8,000 RVU mean? And if a hospital offer you 400,000, what's the economic factors behind the hospital to offer you such a salary?
Well, I'll try to address your second question. As Bill said, you got to look at the length of the contract. So somebody offers you $400,000 starting out, and the contract's for 3 years. You better figure out what's going to happen beyond 3 years. And ultimately, the analysis has to be how much revenue can you bring in as an individual surgeon, and how much revenue is your hospital willing to add into the pot. I'm wary of anyone taking a job that has a salary that's above what would be considered the norm. I mean, I think whenever that happens, the likelihood of that salary being durable is not very high. So what I think you should do, and there are some numbers given that I think are quite reasonable, is figure out what is a starting vascular surgeon likely to make. And you should expect when you go on these job interviews that you're going to make something in that range. And if they're giving you too low, then it's maybe not the right job. But if they're giving you too high of a number, I would worry likewise. I mean, I think that's a struggle likewise. So having something that's in the normal range, I think, is a reasonable approach.
But at what point do you start to ask this question? Is it like you actually visit a group and during an interview, or it's during the communication stage?
I mean, I think you can. It depends. In the academic world, there's a little bit of this tradition of you're not supposed to ask the salary in the first interview, and to be honest, I get a little upset sometimes when people ask me the salary on the first interview. I shouldn't, but I do. But I think in the non-academic world, it's quite reasonable early on to get a sense. And there's a way of asking, even in the academic world, there's a way of asking that I think is very positive. I'm looking at a number of different opportunities. I have my family. We're going to have to move. Can I get a sense of what the salary range would be? Something like that is a very nice way of approaching it. So I think inquiring up front is quite a reasonable thing to do.
Craig, without starting a fight here, why is it okay to ask a private practice doc but not an academic?
It's not.
Just out of curiosity.
It's not. It's not. Did I not look embarrassed when I said that? I looked embarrassed when I said that. I mean, it's just this 25-year-old tradition. No, you should ask an academic doc. And I think the way that I presented it is a great way to ask anybody what your salary will be, because it's important. At the end of the day, it's not about you trying to make a lot of money. It's about you trying to take care of your family. So I think being very upfront and transparent about salaries is the right thing for any environment.
But I don't think that you should make that the point. I mean, the point that I tried to make, it's not your salary that you're starting off with in the first year, unless that's absolutely critical to you. If you're joining a community group, you want to know what you're going to be making when you're a partner. That's a much more important question than what you're going to make in the first couple of years. If you're joining an academic group, they may tell you what the salary is and what you're going to get in the first year, but there's no assurances that you're going to get that salary in the second year. That's one of the problems in joining the hospital. Because the hospital the following year can say, we're reducing your salary 10%, we didn't do as well this year. So you've got to look at the long term, and you can ask me right out, you come to our group and you can ask me the starting salary as in the first question. I don't care, I'll give you the starting salary. It's immaterial.
In some ways it is, and while it's important, I don't think it's necessarily the most important thing, and it's going to be very difficult to determine whether you're going to click with that group or not by window shopping. They may give you that number, but it's different than looking someone in the eye and really seeing whether you're going to have some form of chemistry with the group that you're joining. So,
Yeah, I still would get back to money makes you need money, right? You get paid what you're worth and paid for how you work, but that's not the one thing that's going to make you happy or not if you get into the salary range that those salaries are about. So I think to me the first visit is finding out more about the job, looking at the people you're going to be working with, look at who your boss is going to be, look at what they really want. And then if all that stuff starts to look like something you might be interested in, there's going to be at least one more visit, maybe two more, to sort the other stuff out. So I wouldn't be offended if somebody asked me like Craig did, but when I'm looking at hiring somebody, I usually have some idea in mind of what I want that person to be like or do or what opportunities I can give them. So if they don't focus on that, I'm kind of thinking, well, why do they want to come here? Are they just not really interested in coming to work for me or work for our unit? And also, I disagree with Russ a little bit. I think that no salary is really secure. I mean, any structure can change. I mean, so if you have to figure out really how your revenue is going to be divided up and what your access to ways to generate revenue are, if it's a revenue-driven thing completely.
Yeah, I just want to emphasize the same thing. No salary is secure. I mean, if you have any idea what's going to happen in medicine beyond 3 years, I mean, in medicine, not just vascular surgery, you've got a crystal ball that's better than mine. So in the end, you want to make sure you negotiate a reasonable salary, but you better click and fit well with your institution. I mean, that's going to be the real key to ultimate success, because I can assure you in private practice, you don't know 3 years from now what your salary is going to be, and you certainly don't in academics.
I agree 100% with that, but there's a subtle difference between academic. I've been in both. And I won't talk to university, you can talk there, but in private practice, community practice, or self-employed practice, obviously we don't know what's going to happen. The government can reduce our fees next year, but you have the ability to adjust yourself. You yourself can make the determination as to how you're going to adjust to that salary change. Are you going to work harder? Are you going to do more? Are you going to open up a new lab? Are you going to do something? You can adjust. Whereas if you are on a salary and someone says to you, we are dropping your salary next year 10%, you are somewhat limited.
Yeah, I love debates. So I mean, that all works out fine unless the competing group, on the other side of town comes in and takes half your business away. So I just think that there's a lot of insecurity in medicine, whether you're in academics. I'm not trying to say academics is any better. There's insecurities on both sides.
And I'm sorry, one more thing, since this is a debate.
I know you don't. I know you don't have any competing groups.
We have to get away from this word academic and private practice. I am as academic as most of the people on this podium. I have 93 papers, I've got 27 chapters, and I've lectured all over the world. There are many people in academics that haven't written a single paper. So what we have to do is we've got to say the employed physician and the self-employed physician. Whether you work, you may be a university doctor, you may be a hospital doctor, you may be a community practice. But the so-called word academic is becoming something that I find obscene.
You know, we can continue this over a beer at the Young Surgeons reception at the Sheraton. Everyone is invited. Thank you very much for the speakers and for the attendees.